While muscle car engines are a symbol of global automotive pride, not all of them lived up to the hype. Some lacked real power, while others delivered none of the excitement, making even smaller, more efficient engines feel more thrilling. So, here are the 12 worst muscle car engines ever made. Number 12. Cadillac's 864. The Cadillac 864 engine was one of the strangest muscle car engines ever made. It was big, 366 cubic inches in size, and it came with a very unusual trick. This engine could turn itself into a 6-cylinder or even a 4-cylinder while driving. That's right, it was built to shut off some of its parts to save fuel. Sounds smart, right? But what happened under the hood was far from smooth. Right from the start, things didn't go well. This engine used a special computer system to decide when to turn off 2 or 4 cylinders. That meant it could drive using only 4 or 6 parts of the engine instead of all 8. But here's the twist. This computer just wasn't fast or smart enough. It tried to read all kinds of things like air pressure, engine speed, and temperature, but it couldn't keep up. Drivers often felt the engine stop and start in a strange, choppy way. Next up, real problems. The parts that were supposed to shut off the cylinders used solenoids and rocker arms, and these didn't work quickly enough. So when someone pressed the gas pedal, the engine didn't give power right away. Instead, it felt confused, like it was trying to guess what to do. That made driving hard and not smooth at all. Even worse, the fuel system added more trouble. The engine used throttle body injection, which means fuel was sprayed into the top of the engine. But when the cylinders were off for too long, fuel would collect and sit. Then, when those parts started working again, too much fuel would rush in all at once. That made the engine feel jumpy and off balance. And here comes another odd piece. Cadillac added a display on the dashboard called the MPG Sentinel. It told you how many cylinders were being used, but drivers didn't need to look because they could feel it. The car shook, paused, and sometimes even jerked as the engine changed modes. It was a constant reminder that the engine was struggling. More to know, drivers quickly got tired of the problem. Some cars were brought in again and again to fix the software. In fact, 13 different updates were sent out in just 1 year, but none of them fully fixed it. After all those tries, the system was quietly turned off in most cars. From then on, the engine just stayed in 8-cylinder mode all the time. Let's not forget the hunting problem. While cruising at steady speeds, the engine sometimes couldn't decide how many cylinders to use. It kept switching between 4, 6, and 8. That made the car feel like it was changing gears even when it wasn't. It wasn't just confusing, it made the car hard to trust on the road. Even with all this effort, the engine didn't save that much fuel. In real life, drivers only got around 15% better fuel mileage. And for that small gain, they had to deal with hesitation, lurching, poor power, and a system that just didn't work right. Number 11, Triumph Stag V8. The Triumph Stag V8 engine had a powerful heart for a sporty British car, but under its shiny looks, it carried one of the most broken designs ever seen in a muscle car engine. At first, the idea was to make a new 152 cubic inch V8 by joining 2 4-cylinder engines together. This might sound clever, but what came next turned that idea into a long list of headaches. To begin with, the engine was supposed to use fuel injection. That plan failed during testing, so the engineers switched to a twin carburetor setup. This choice made the engine weaker and less fuel efficient, so to bring the power back up, they made the cylinders bigger. But this small change brought big problems. Making the cylinder bores wider took away space meant for coolant flow, shrinking the cooling passages inside the engine. That meant the engine couldn't keep itself cool, especially under load or in warm weather. Now here's where it gets worse. Unlike most engines that have a water pump on the front, this engine placed the pump high on top inside the V shape between the cylinders. The pump was powered by gears inside the engine, not by a belt. And those gears often broke without warning. When that happened, the pump stopped working and the coolant stopped moving. Even worse, the pump sat higher than the radiator cap. So when adding coolant, the liquid couldn't even reach the pump unless the car was jacked up at an angle. That made overheating almost guaranteed. Moving on to the materials used, the Triumph engine had an iron block with aluminum heads. This mix isn't always bad, but it demands special coolant to stop metal corrosion inside. Back then, hardly anyone used the right coolant. The result? Corrosion built up inside, causing clogs, leaks, and more overheating. And the temperature sensor, which should have told the driver when things got hot, was only connected to one side of the engine. If the other side overheated, the gauge showed nothing, leaving the driver unaware until it was too late. But the most baffling decision of all was in the head bolts. Half of the bolts went in straight, just like normal. The other half was tilted at an angle. This was meant to help mechanics remove the cylinder heads without disturbing the camshafts. In real life, it caused warping. As the engine heated up, the different angles stretched the heads unevenly. That pressure twisted the metal and often led to head gasket failure. Making things even harder, those long bolts would sometimes fuse to the aluminum heads, making repairs nearly impossible. The Triumph Stag V8 was a rare mix of high hopes and terrible choices. From a water pump that refused to stay alive, to cooling passages squeezed too tight, to cylinder heads twisted out of shape, every part of this engine seemed to fight against itself. Number 10. Oldsmobile's Diesel V8. The Oldsmobile 350 cubic inch Diesel V8 was designed in the late 1970s to help General Motors follow new fuel rules. But instead of making something strong and smart, they rushed out an engine filled with serious problems. Right from the start, the engine was built using the same block as the old gasoline V8. That may sound like a shortcut, but diesel engines need to be much stronger inside. They use higher pressure and need better parts to handle it. This engine didn't get those stronger pieces. It just got bigger pistons, heavier crankshaft parts, and some slightly changed heads. That made the engine heavy and weak at the same time. Digging deeper, the power was very low. At first, it made only 120 horsepower. Later, it was tuned down even more to just 105 horsepower. That's not a good number for a V8 engine. And while it did make around 200 pound-feet of torque, it still felt slow and sluggish. Many drivers noticed it couldn't even keep up with small four-cylinder cars on the road. Moving on to real trouble, the fuel system. Diesel engines need clean, dry fuel to work well, but this engine often let water get into the fuel, and the fuel injector pumps would start to rust. Once that happened, the engine ran rough or didn't run at all. Add in leaking head gaskets and oil pans, and it became clear the engine wasn't made to last. More issues appeared fast. The engine was loud and gave off thick black smoke. That made it feel old-fashioned even when it was brand new. The automatic transmissions paired with this engine also struggled. They didn't shift well and sometimes broke under the stress. That sent many drivers straight back to the dealership for repairs. One huge mistake was how fast the engine was pushed into so many cars. It showed up in full-size models, mid-size models, and even luxury cars. It was supposed to help fuel numbers for the company, but instead, it caused massive complaints. Mechanics were flooded with broken engines. Even though it helped gas mileage a little, the constant engine failures were too much. Let's not forget the cooling problems. This diesel V8 had a hard time keeping itself at the right temperature. The block and heads didn't match well, which led to cracks and leaks. If the engine got too hot, the damage was often permanent. These failures gave diesel engines in cars a very bad name for many years. By the early 1980s, the engine was still being used, but almost nobody trusted it anymore. More than half of all diesel cars sold in the United States came with this engine at one point, but the damage was done. The Diesel V8 is crowned as one of the most broken engines ever placed in a muscle car. Number 9. Vega 140 cubic inch four-cylinder. The Vega 140 cubic inch four-cylinder engine was built fast to compete with the other small cars. The engine was part of a project that was rushed from the start. It was made of aluminum and featured a special silicone coating inside the cylinders. This coating was supposed to help reduce wear, but it didn't last. Over time, the coating began to wear away, scratching the walls and damaging the pistons. Let's look inside. The engine used a single overhead cam design. That was advanced for its day. It made around 70 horsepower with a single-barrel carburetor and up to 85 with a two-barrel setup. A special GT version made 110 horsepower. That might sound okay, but the trouble wasn't the power, it was how the engine held up over time. In addition, the cooling system was a major issue. I didn't do a good job of moving coolant through the engine. That meant the engine could get too hot during normal driving. Hot engines need good oil flow too, but the oil system wasn't built strong either. Leaks were common, coolant would leak, oil would leak, and both fluids were needed to keep the engine healthy. Without them, the metal parts inside would grind, overheat, and slowly break apart. Adding to the problems, the aluminum engine block had no steel liners. That meant the piston rings rubbed directly against the soft aluminum walls. As more miles were driven, the walls wore down quickly. This caused oil burning, poor compression, and eventually total failure. Some engines started smoking before hitting 50,000 miles. Next, let's talk about sealing. The head gasket, which keeps the top and bottom of the engine sealed, often fails. Coolant would mix with oil, causing even more engine damage. With a better design, this could have been avoided. But the engine was rushed into production to meet deadlines, and many small details were skipped or poorly tested. Over time, owners started seeing real problems. Cars overheated on hot days. Oil covered the driveway. Some engines lost power or wouldn't start. It wasn't just one issue, it was many problems happening at once. Mechanics had trouble fixing them, and some engines had to be fully replaced. The early models also came with different types of transmissions: 3-speed manual, 4-speed manual, a 2-speed automatic called Power Glide, and a simple semi-automatic. But none of those could hide the engine's flaws. Even with smooth shifting, the engine was still the weak point. While the car itself had nice ideas like front disc brakes and good handling, the engine didn't match the rest. It couldn't keep up with daily driving, and it wasn't built to last. The damage done by poor cooling, soft cylinder walls, and leaking seals made this 4-cylinder one of the most troubled engines ever put into a muscle-style compact car. Number 8. Mercedes-Benz M139 engine. The Mercedes-Benz M139 engine is a small 4-cylinder with big numbers, but it brings more problems than power. This engine was placed in the 5th-generation performance model, replacing a loud and strong V8 with a quiet and complex setup. Right away, many drivers felt disappointed. The sound was gone, and so was the raw muscle car feel. Now let's look inside. The M139 is a turbocharged inline-4 with hybrid help. It makes over 670 horsepower, which sounds exciting, but the way it gets there is not simple. This engine uses electric power, hybrid tech, and a high-pressure turbo. All these systems must work together smoothly, and that's where it gets tricky. More parts mean more chances for things to go wrong. Speaking of design, the engine was rotated 180 degrees. This was done so the intake faces forward, and the hot turbo parts sit behind the engine near the firewall. Mercedes says this improves airflow, but it also makes heat control harder and repair work more difficult. The hot turbo placed close to the cabin might cause heat issues over time. It also makes cooling the engine more challenging in tight spaces. Under pressure now, the M139 runs with a higher compression ratio, 9.0 to 1 compared to older versions. That means it pushes fuel and air harder, which makes more power but puts more stress on engine parts. The exhaust valves were made bigger to handle this, but that still doesn't solve long-term wear on a small 4-cylinder, making power levels that used to come from much larger engines. Next, the engine uses a 2-stage fuel injection system. The first part injects fuel directly into the cylinders with piezo injectors. The second part adds fuel through the intake with solenoid valves. This design helps increase power, but also adds even more moving parts. With more complexity comes higher chances of leaks, clogs, or failure, especially after long use. Let's move to the turbo. The M139 uses an electric turbo built with help from a top turbo maker. It spins fast, helps power come in early, and smooths out turbo lag. But again, this system needs careful balancing of power, timing, and heat. If any part of the turbo system slips out of sync, the engine loses power or goes into safety mode. The real issue here is not just with power or design, it's how this engine replaced the trusted V8. Muscle car fans expect deep sound and strong torque from low speeds. The M139, with its hybrid and turbo layout, delivers its punch later and sounds more like a vacuum than a muscle car. For many, this engine was the wrong kind of powerful. Number 7. Toyota 3VZE 183 cubic inch V6. The 3VZ 183 cubic inch V6 engine was built for trucks and sport utility vehicles, but it simply wasn't tough enough for the job. Even though it was a big size, the power was small. It made only 150 horsepower and 180 pound-feet of torque. That's not enough for big vehicles that need muscle to move through hills, mud, or towing heavy loads. Let's move deeper into the engine. One big issue was overheating. The cooling system didn't work well. The coolant fan didn't push enough air, and the flow of coolant through the engine wasn't even. Some parts stayed cooler than others, and that uneven heat made the engine wear out faster. It caused the most common failure, the head gasket. Now, about that gasket, the head gasket is a very important seal between the engine block and the cylinder head. It keeps coolant and engine oil from mixing and holds pressure. But this engine used a weak material for the gasket. Over time, that seal would break down. When it failed, coolant would leak inside the engine. That would cause white smoke from the exhaust and even milky oil, which is a bad sign of coolant mixing into the oil. When this happened, the engine would quickly overheat and suffer major damage. Adding more trouble, the timing belt was also weak. This belt controls when the engine valves open and close. In the 3VZE engine, the belt wore out fast and had to be replaced often, about every 60,000 miles. If the belt snapped while the engine was running, it could lead to bent valves or even a ruined engine. More to uncover, the engine also had starter contact problems. That made starting the engine unreliable, especially in cold weather. The exhaust gas recirculation system, known as EGR, often failed too. When the EGR system didn't work, it caused rough running and poor emissions. Another serious concern was the burning of exhaust valves. The engine would run hot, and the valves could overheat. Once burned, these valves would stop sealing properly, causing poor compression and loss of power. Even the connecting rod bearings didn't hold up well. They would wear down faster than expected, leading to knocking noises inside the engine block. That knock meant trouble was near, and the engine was wearing out quickly. To add to the worries, some engines even cracked their cylinder heads. That is a major failure that could lead to coolant leaks, loss of pressure, and complete engine breakdown. Even with regular care, this engine had a short life, usually around 180,000 miles. That's low for a truck engine, especially from a company known for building long-lasting machines. Number 6. Oldsmobile LF9 V8. The Oldsmobile LF9 V8 diesel engine came out in the year 1978. It was supposed to help cars save fuel and meet new environmental rules. But under the hood, this big engine was filled with problems. Even though it had 350 cubic inches in size, it only made 120 horsepower. That is a very low number for such a large V8. Later versions made just 105 horsepower, which made cars feel slow and heavy. Now let's look at what went wrong. One of the biggest issues was the head gasket. It often blew out because the bolts holding the cylinder heads were too weak. This caused engine leaks, overheating, and major damage. As time went on, these head bolts even started snapping, leading to costly repairs and unhappy owners. Moving along, there was no water separator in the fuel system. That meant water from diesel fuel could get into the injection pump. Once inside, the water would rust the metal parts. This could ruin the injectors and stop fuel from reaching the engine. To try and fix this, some people added alcohol-based dry gas to the fuel, but that made things worse. The alcohol broke apart rubber rings inside the pump, and those bits would block fuel lines. Even more trouble came from the fuel pump itself. It used a chain to run, and that chain would stretch over time. When this happened, the timing of the fuel injection would become too late. That meant poor combustion, low power, and rough engine running. Combined with other problems, this made the car feel weak and slow on the road. Let's talk about noise and smoke. This engine rattled a lot, especially outside the car. It sounded like a school bus, and drivers could hear the loud knocking. Inside, GM tried to hide the sound with extra insulation, but it still wasn't quiet. The engine also blew out black smoke, which made it look dirty and smell bad. This smoke was full of soot, something now known to be dangerous to health. The LF9 ran at very high compression, 22.5 to 1. That's great for power, but the engine parts weren't strong enough to handle that pressure. It caused cracked blocks, broken bolts, and overheating. The engine also needed 2 batteries just to start up in cold weather and used a 10 horsepower starter motor to crank it. Dealerships didn't know how to fix it well. Most mechanics weren't trained on diesel engines, and that made repairs slower and harder. Many cars were left sitting in shops with no answers. Even though some later models had better parts, like stronger blocks and roller cams, this diesel V8 didn't live up to its promise and left many drivers frustrated. Number 5. Chevrolet 262 Small Block V8. The The Chevrolet 262 cubic inch small block V8 engine came out in the year 1975. This engine was meant to bring smoother rides and better fuel use, but right from the start, it failed to impress the buyers. Let's get right into the heart of the issue, the engine's features and why it struggled so much. To begin with, the 262 was the smallest V8 in Chevrolet's small block family, well smaller than many modern six-cylinder engines. With a low compression ratio of 8.5 to 1 and a two-barrel carburetor, it was only able to make 110 horsepower at 3,600 revolutions per minute. That's not much power for an engine that was supposed to give muscle car vibes. Now moving forward, the torque didn't impress either. This little V8 could only push out 200 pound-feet of torque at just 2,000 revolutions per minute. For comparison, older Chevy V8s from the 1950s had much more strength. This made the 262 feel slow, especially when packed into heavier cars like the Monza or the Nova. Adding to the trouble, it wasn't just about power. The engine's design caused real headaches for mechanics. A known issue was the number 3 spark plug. It was stuck in such a tight corner of the engine bay that removing it meant lifting the engine slightly. That's a big job just for a single spark plug, making repairs harder and more time-consuming than they needed to be. Next up, let's talk about how it performed on the road. Tests showed that a Monza with this engine needed 13.4 seconds to go from 0 to 60 miles per hour. Even worse, it took 19.5 seconds to complete a quarter mile, finishing at just 72.5 miles per hour. This was far behind other cars in its class. Shifting gears a bit, emissions rules also made things harder for the 262. The emissions controls of that time were simple and often choked the engine's power even more. And in some areas, especially places with high altitudes or tougher rules like California, the engine didn't even meet local requirements. So buyers there got a bigger V8 instead. One more issue was how crowded the engine compartment became. With the 262 stuffed in tightly alongside power steering and air conditioning systems, cooling and airflow were limited. This made the engine run hotter and less efficiently. Although it came with hopes of modern fuel-saving muscle, its short lifespan and disappointing output made it a forgotten chapter in the small block V8 story. Number 4, Chrysler Lean Burn V8. The Chrysler Lean Burn V8 engine made its first appearance in the year 1976. Chrysler tried to make this V8 cleaner and smarter by using one of the earliest computer-controlled spark systems in a car. But instead of success, this idea turned into one of the most disappointing muscle car engines of its time. Let's begin with the lean burn system itself. The idea was to use a computer to read different parts of the engine and adjust how and when the spark plugs fired. This would help the engine run better, use less fuel, and produce fewer dirty gases. The system had 3 main parts: a special carburetor, a spark control computer, and 8 sensors placed around the engine. These sensors read things like air temperature, engine heat, and how fast the gas pedal was being pressed. At first glance, it sounded great. The lean burn engine ran with an air-to-fuel mix of 18 parts air to 1 part fuel, compared to the normal 14.7 to 1. That's very lean and very tricky. The engine could meet emissions rules without using a catalytic converter, which was a big deal back then. In early road tests, cars with this system even showed better gas mileage than some older, more powerful V8s. Now here's where the trouble began. The computer that controlled everything was placed right on top of the air cleaner, one of the hottest and most vibration-filled spots under the hood. That made the computer very likely to fail. When it did, the engine would misfire, stall, or just stop running smoothly. Adding to the headache, this system used a huge number of vacuum hoses. These hoses were everywhere, and if even one of them leaked or disconnected, the whole setup would stop working properly. Mechanics at the time weren't trained to work on these systems, and many people didn't trust the black box computer at all. As time went on, things got worse. More Chrysler V8 engines from 318 to 440 cubic inches were given lean burn, but stricter emission laws meant even this system needed help from a catalytic converter. That defeated the whole purpose. By the late 1970s, many drivers were so frustrated with the problems that they pulled the system off and replaced it with old-fashioned parts. Even though the lean burn system was a step toward the future, the heat, the sensors, and the constant vacuum leaks turned it into one of the most unreliable V8 engines Chrysler ever made. Number 3. Cadillac HT4100 V8. The Cadillac HT4100 V8 was called high technology, but the name didn't match the result. This engine had a 250 cubic inch size. It looked smart on paper. It had a light aluminum block, iron heads, and throttle body fuel injection, which was very new for its time. At first, people thought it might be a smooth and modern motor for Cadillac cars. But once the engine was in real cars, problems started to show fast. Right away, one big issue stood out. The aluminum block and the cast iron head didn't mix well. These metals heat and cool at different speeds, and that caused the engine's head gaskets to fail. When that happened, coolant leaked out, the engine overheated, and bigger damage followed. And sadly, coolant leaks were very common with this engine. Even worse, the bolts holding the head to the block were made of hard steel. When the engine got hot, the bolts would sometimes rip through the soft aluminum, causing even more problems. Add that to the engine being rushed into production before it was fully tested, and the trouble just kept piling up. And now let's look at the power. This V8 engine only made 135 horsepower and 200 pound-feet of torque. That's not a lot. Even smaller V6 engines could match or beat those numbers. Even though the HT4100 had 8 cylinders, it was not stronger than a simpler, older 6-cylinder engine. In fact, the 6-cylinder version in some cars at the time was slightly more fuel efficient. More problems continued to show. Oil pump failures were common. Some engines even had their head bolts pull right out of the aluminum block over time. The block itself had thin walls to save weight, but that also made it weaker and more likely to warp or crack. These kinds of engine troubles were not just rare cases. They happened often enough that people lost trust in this motor quickly. At first, drivers liked how quiet and smooth the engine was, but that did not last long. Once repairs started showing up often, the excitement turned into frustration. The engine had all the parts of something advanced, but it didn't hold up well under real use. Every time the engine overheated or a gasket failed, it reminded people that good ideas need good design and time to be ready. Number 2. Buick 350. The Buick 350 V8 engine had deep skirt cylinders to help hold the crankshaft steady and tall, narrow heads for smoother airflow. The engine came in both 2-barrel and 4-barrel carburetor models. In its strongest form, it made up to 315 horsepower and 410 pound-feet of torque. On paper, this sounded like a muscle car winner. But let's talk about where it struggled. First off, the oiling system was one of its biggest weaknesses. The oil feed holes were very small, which made it hard for oil to reach important parts. The main bearing oil hole often didn't line up correctly, and the camshaft also got poor oiling. Over time, this could hurt the engine badly if not fixed early. On top of that, the oil pump itself would often fail too soon. That's not all. The cast aluminum timing cover was fragile and could crack and leak. Once that happened, oil pressure would drop and the engine would wear out quickly. Moving ahead, another problem came from the water pump. Its design was weak, and it often gave up too soon. The only real solution was replacing it and hoping it lasted longer next time. The camshaft drive was no better. The cam chain and gear wore out faster than they should. This would mess up engine timing and cause more damage if left alone. As we go deeper, these problems show just how much care this engine needed. When it came to pushing power, the engine block was strong. It could handle more than 1,000 horsepower without trouble. But the inside parts told a different story. The crankshaft and connecting rods could hold up to around 550 horsepower. But after that, they needed to be replaced. The pistons were the weakest point. Even at just 400 horsepower, they needed to be upgraded. Forged pistons were a good choice, but hard to find and expensive. Some used hyper-eutectic pistons, but those were not as strong. Despite its strong block, the Buick 350 V8 was full of problems under the surface. The power was there in the early days, but once oiling, cooling, and internal wear issues showed up, it needed constant care. Even owners who skipped maintenance saw the engine fail too soon. Number 1. Pontiac 301 Turbo. The Pontiac 301 turbo engine was used mostly in the Firebird Trans Am and a few Firebird Formula models. This engine had one goal: to give good power while following the new emissions rules. But even with turbocharging, things did not go as planned. Let's start with the build. The engine had a small block size, only 301 cubic inches. To handle turbo power, Pontiac made the block thicker, gave it stronger parts, a hotter camshaft, and dropped the compression ratio to 7.6 to 1, later changed to 7.5 to 1. On top of the engine sat an oil-cooled Garrett turbo, pushing 9 pounds of boost. It made 210 horsepower. Not so impressive. Now here's where it went wrong. First big issue, turbo coking. Because the turbo was cooled only by oil, shutting the engine off too soon after driving would make the oil inside the turbo cook into hard deposits. This clogged the turbo bearings and could ruin the whole turbo system. Back then, people didn't know they had to let the engine idle to cool it down. Let's go further. The turbocharger sat right on top of the engine, next to the carburetor. That made the engine bay very hot. That heat plus regular low-octane fuel caused knocking and detonation. To stop engine damage, the spark control system would pull back power at the first sign of knock. This killed the performance even more. Another problem, turbo lag. This engine didn't feel strong at low speeds. You had to wait for the turbo to spin up and make boost. Until then, the engine felt slow. With a tall 3.08 to 1 axle and only an automatic transmission, it had weak launch power too. The engine never came to California. That state got a different V8 engine instead. And even though it was rated just 10 horsepower less than the older 400 horsepower engine, it was way slower in real driving. The older engine had more than 260 horsepower, in truth, and the 301 turbo couldn't keep up, losing by over 1.5 seconds in quarter-mile tests. Thanks for sticking around as we look back at some of the most disappointing muscle car engines ever made. If you enjoyed this breakdown, drop a comment, hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe for more honest takes on classic rides in engine legends.